Tony Beets just revealed something so unsettling from deep inside his mining claim that the entire crew is shaken, and the Yukon will never feel the same again. Whatever he found beneath that dredge has forced him to break his silence, and the truth is far stranger than gold. Before we dig into the disturbing chain of events Tony just exposed, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to hear was never meant to leave the mine. The morning it all began didn't look unusual, but it felt wrong, and Tony Beets sensed it before anyone said a word. The Yukon is always quiet in the early hours, but this silence was different. It was thick, heavy, almost intentional, like the land itself was holding its breath. Frost clung to the gravel in thin white sheets, and the air carried that sharp metallic bite that usually signals a storm. But there was no wind, no clouds, not even the distant rumble of the river, just stillness. Tony walked the claim the way he always did, boots crunching softly as he moved past the idle machinery. Usually the site had a pulse, engines warming up, cables clinking, radios crackling with gruff early morning chatter. But today, the crew spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the dredge more than they looked at each other. No jokes, no complaints. Even Rick, who never shut up before his third cup of coffee, stood unusually quiet with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Tony noticed it immediately. The dredge looked wrong, not broken, not damaged, just wrong. The air around it was colder, like a bubble of winter hanging stubbornly over that one piece of machinery. Even the fog seemed to avoid it, drifting around the perimeter like it didn't want to come near. And the birds, normally perched on the cables waiting for breakfast scraps, were nowhere in sight. He paused, narrowing his eyes at the metal giant. "You boys notice anything off?" he muttered, without turning around. A couple of the younger workers nodded, but no one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Tony took another step forward, then stopped. There, almost too faint to catch, a tremor ran through the ground. Not a quake, not machinery. A single pulse, like something deep beneath the earth had just shifted. Rick finally spoke. "Tony, something's not right with the dredge." Tony shot him a look. No kidding. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades of mining. A prickling sense of unease, like he was being watched by something he couldn't see. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The moment the crew tried to shake the morning off and get back to work, the sound returned. Quiet at first, almost easy to dismiss. The clattering of equipment and the rumble of generators usually swallowed every stray noise. But this one pushed through everything, rising slow and steady from the dredge, like a warning hiding inside the metal. It started as a faint drag, a long, low scrape that didn't match any part of the machine. Not a jammed bucket, not a loose chain, not even the harsh grind of worn gears. This sound had weight to it, a pulse, as if something inside the dredge was moving on its own. One of the guys, Caleb, the youngest, froze mid-step. "You hear that?" he whispered. Rick nodded without looking up, his face tightening. "It's coming from below." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Most noises on a mine become background static after years on the job. But this was different. It felt deliberate, like a slow heartbeat echoing through sheet metal and frozen ground. Tony walked toward the dredge, every instinct telling him to stop, but every ounce of stubbornness pushing him forward. The closer he got, the more defined the noise became. It wasn't just a drag anymore. It was rhythmic, deep, almost organic. Then, as he reached the base of the machine, the sound stopped. Dead silent. No birds, no wind, no engines. Just Tony standing alone in the frozen quiet, his breath fogging in front of him like smoke from a dying fire. He took another step. The metal beneath his glove was ice cold, colder than the air, colder than steel should ever be in that temperature. He leaned in, listening, waiting for the sound to return. Instead, something else happened. A sharp, metallic creak snapped through the dredge, loud enough to make the crew jolt. The noise was so sudden, so out of place, it felt like the machine had exhaled. After holding its breath for too long, Tony stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Get me a light," he said calmly. Too calmly. Rick jogged over, handing him a flashlight with hands that weren't as steady as he wanted them to be. When Tony angled the beam along the lower hull, the light caught something strange, a smear of liquid clinging to the metal, thick, glossy, and faintly glowing, as if it held its own source of light deep inside. Rick leaned in. "Is that oil?" Tony touched it with the end of his glove and instantly wished he hadn't. The substance moved. Not like a drip, not like something falling. It shifted, stretching thin across the fabric of the glove, as though it recognized warmth or life. Tony stared, his breath catching. "That's no oil." Before anyone could respond, the dredge gave a low rumble, deeper than any motor could produce, rolling through the ground like something big had just woken up. And for the first time in a long time, Tony Beets felt fear. As the strange glow crawled across Tony's glove, the crew stood frozen, instincts battling between curiosity and the urge to run. The substance moved with unsettling purpose, stretching, thinning, as if tasting the air. Even in the dim morning light, it shimmered like liquid silver, with a faint pulse beneath its surface, almost alive. Tony scraped his glove against his jeans, expecting it to smear away like mud or oil. But instead, the glowing film spread thinner, clinging to the fabric like it was growing. Rick took an uneasy step back. "Boss, that ain't normal." Tony didn't answer. He couldn't. The dredge, silent for a breathless moment, suddenly groaned, a deep metallic bowing of steel that rolled through the entire frame. Every bolt and beam seemed to tighten at once, like the machine was bracing against something unseen. Then they all saw it. The glowing substance on the side of the dredge began moving on its own, stretching into long, thin lines that slithered across the metal. At first, it looked random, like spilled paint sliding downhill. But the lines kept forming tight, looping shapes. Circles within circles, spirals crossing over themselves, patterns that didn't belong on any machine, patterns that almost looked intentional, as if something was marking the dredge, branding it. "What the hell?" Rick whispered. Tony stepped back, his jaw tightening. He'd spent his life around machinery, enough to know what was natural and what wasn't. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't a chemical reaction. This felt intelligent. Before he could say another word, the dredge jolted, a violent, sudden shudder that rattled chains, buckets, beams, everything. The entire structure trembled as if something massive had slammed into it from the inside. The crew stumbled backward, shouting, scrambling to distance themselves. "Shut it down!" Tony barked. But no one was at the controls. The dredge roared to life on its own. Buckets churned, chains rattled. A low mechanical roar filled the valley, echoing off the icy slopes. The lights flickered, then went dead, yet the machine kept running, driven by a force that wasn't electrical or mechanical. Rick yelled, "Tony, it's not responding!" Tony stared up at the towering dredge, watching as the glowing lines disappeared into the shifting metal, sinking deeper into the machine like veins being pulled under skin. He didn't say a word, but every man on that site felt the same cold realization. The dredge was no longer just a machine. Something inside it had awakened. The dredge roared on without a single human hand touching it, rattling and clanking in a way no machine should. The ground trembled beneath the crew's boots. Dust drifted from the steel joints like the dredge had taken a breath after years of sleeping. And then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. Silence hit the valley with an unnatural weight. The wind died. The birds vanished. Even the generators seemed to hold their hum. Tony raised a hand, signaling the men to stay back as he took a cautious step toward the massive frame. His flashlight beam cut across the metal, landing on something that made his stomach drop. Those same strange patterns now faintly pulsing beneath the dredge's outer shell, like symbols branded into the steel. "Tony, don't go up there," Rick said, voice tight. But Tony climbed anyway. Each step up the ladder echoed deep inside the dredge. When he reached the opening, a sudden cold pushed out from the darkness. So cold it stung his skin. The smell was wrong too. Not oil, not rust, something sharper, metallic yet burnt, like an electrical fire that never happened. He pointed the flashlight inside. For a moment, he didn't see anything except the familiar maze of metal. Then a faint reflection caught his eye, wet, shimmering, and impossibly thin. On the floor, smeared across the steel, was more of that liquid metal, but this time it wasn't moving. It was listening. And then it happened. A voice, not loud, not clear, but there. A whisper drifting up from inside the dredge, carried on the cold air. Words Tony couldn't understand. Low, broken syllables, like something trying to speak for the first time in a century. Rick shouted from below, "Boss, get out of there!" But Tony barely heard him. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, more human. Tony stepped back, gripping the ladder rails as the voice layered itself, echoing, repeating, overlapping like several tones trying to form a single sentence. Then it stopped. The dredge let out a slow, metallic creak, almost like a sigh. And in that silence, Tony realized his flashlight was trembling, not from his hand, but from the floor beneath him, warming slightly, as if something just beneath the metal skin had shifted. He climbed down without a word, stepping into the snow-dusted ground where the crew waited with wide, frightened eyes. Rick approached slowly. "What did you hear?" Tony didn't look at him. Instead, he stared at the dredge, at the silent giant that now felt alive. "I don't know what it was," Tony whispered, "but it wasn't a machine." By the time the crew regained their nerve, the dredge stood still again, towering and silent, like it had returned to sleep after showing them a glimpse of something they were never meant to witness. But Tony wasn't done. He motioned for Rick to grab the spare lantern, and together they climbed back up toward the top platform. Everyone else stayed behind. No one wanted to be anywhere near that machine. Inside the dredge, the stale, cold air clung to them like frost. Dust floated slowly in the lantern's glow. At first, everything looked normal, until Rick's flashlight beam landed on a shape partly buried under old debris. "Tony! What's that?" Tony stepped closer, brushing aside rust and dirt. The metal beneath wasn't the same color as the dredge. This piece was darker, smoother, and strangely warm despite the freezing air. When he wiped it clean with his glove, they both froze. It wasn't from the dredge. It wasn't from any equipment they owned. It looked manufactured, yet ancient. A long, curved fragment, almost like part of a panel or casing, etched with patterns so precise they looked carved by lasers. But the strangest part wasn't the shape. It was the movement beneath its surface. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. A faint pulse, a slow shimmer, like something alive was trapped inside the metal. "Rick, don't touch it," Tony whispered, but it was too late. Rick had already pressed 2 fingers to the surface. He jerked his hand back instantly and swore. It wasn't just warm, it throbbed like a heartbeat. Tony leaned in, inspecting the edges. There was no rust, no decay. In fact, the metal looked as if it had only recently been exposed, despite being buried in the dredge's guts. "What do you think it is?" Rick asked, voice shaking. Tony didn't answer. He didn't want to. He wrapped the fragment in an old canvas tarp and tucked it under his arm. Whatever this thing was, it shouldn't have been here. Not inside a decades-old machine, not in the Yukon wilderness, not anywhere near ordinary mining operations. On their way down the ladder, the dredge moaned, once, long and low, like metal bending under a slow, invisible pressure. The lantern flickered. Rick tripped 2 steps, scrambling to get out. Back on the ground, the others gathered around, sensing something was wrong. Tony didn't say a word. He carried the wrapped fragment straight to his cabin and slammed the door behind him. For hours, no one saw him, but they heard him, pacing, muttering, occasionally stopping as if listening to something only he could hear. And when he finally stepped back outside that night, he looked pale, shaken, different. He told the crew only one thing: from now on, nobody goes near that dredge alone. But the damage was already done. They had found something unnatural, something hidden, something that hadn't wanted to be uncovered. And it wasn't finished with them yet. By the next morning, nobody was talking about anything except the strange fragment Tony had hauled into his cabin. Whatever he'd seen or heard inside that room overnight had left him quieter than usual, haunted even. He barely touched his coffee, barely answered anyone, and every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward the dredge, as if he expected it to move again. Then, right around noon, it began. The hum, soft at first, low and distant, almost like the faint vibration of a generator buried underground. The men stopped what they were doing, glancing up one by one. The sound was coming from the dredge, but nothing was running. "Tell me you hear that," Caleb whispered. Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, and it ain't the hydraulics." The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground so subtly you could feel it in your shoes. Even the tools hanging on the side of the workshop trembled slightly. The air around them felt different too, thicker, heavier, like the moment before a lightning strike. Tony stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "It's reacting," he muttered. "Reacting to what?" Rick asked, voice tense. Tony didn't answer. He only stared at the dredge, at the steel plates that now seemed to shift ever so slightly, like tendons beneath skin. The hum grew louder, resonating through the metal frame until the bucket line began to rattle softly on its own. And then, a metallic ping echoed through the clearing, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. But the dredge was off. No power, no fuel flow, no controls engaged. The machine was dead, yet it was moving like something inside it was trying to break out. Tony backed up a step. "Get away from it," he said. "Now!" The men scrambled backward as a long, deep groan rolled through the structure. Dust shook free from the top beams. A loose chain whipped gently back and forth as if stirred by an invisible hand. Rick grabbed Tony's arm. "Is this because of that thing we found?" Tony didn't have to answer. His silence was the answer. The hum abruptly cut off, like someone had flipped a switch. Then, after several seconds of dead quiet, a new sound slithered out from deep inside the dredge. A whisper, not wind, not machinery, a human tone, soft, slow, broken, like someone trying to speak through metal. Tony's face drained of color. The hair on his arms stood straight. Rick's flashlight slipped from his hand and clattered onto the frozen ground. The whisper came again, clearer this time, shivering through the steel panels like a breath exhaled through a hollow pipe. Every man froze. Nobody could make out words, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. It sounded like someone trapped, someone calling, begging, or warning. The dredge let out one final moan, and then the valley fell silent again. Tony cleared his throat, steadying himself. "Pack it up," he said quietly. "Nobody works near that thing until I say otherwise." Nobody argued. Nobody dared, because something had awakened inside the dredge, and it wasn't done speaking. That evening, when the crew finally drifted back to their cabins, Rick found Tony sitting alone at the edge of the fire pit. No flames, no smoke, just Tony staring at the wrapped fragment like it was something dangerous, something alive. "You didn't sleep last night, did you?" Rick asked quietly. Tony didn't look up. "It changed." Rick stiffened. "What do you mean it changed?" Tony finally lifted the tarp. Beneath it, the fragment pulsed, soft, rhythmic, almost biological. The carvings, once sharp and jagged, now looked smoother, melted, reformed into new patterns that curved like veins or circuitry. "This wasn't here yesterday," Tony said, pointing to a small circular marking at the center. "It looked almost like an eye, and I didn't carve it." Rick stepped back instinctively. "Tony, maybe we should tell somebody about this." "Tell who?" Tony snapped. "A scientist? A reporter? The police?" He shook his head. "They'll think we've lost it, and if they don't, they'll take it away." A cold gust swept through the camp, rattling the dredge in the distance. The hum returned, just once, but enough to make them both freeze. Then came something worse, a sound from inside the dredge. Not mechanical, not natural. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, like someone pacing inside the metal halls. Rick's breath hitched. "There's no one up there." Tony didn't respond. He tightened the tarp around the fragment as if shielding it from whatever walked inside that machine. A moment later, the footsteps stopped. Then, 3 sharp taps echoed through the steel. Not random, not accidental. A pattern, like someone or something was knocking. Rick whispered, "It knows we're here." Tony didn't deny it. In fact, he looked down at the fragment in his hands and whispered back, "I think it's trying to call something." The wind shifted again. The dredge moaned low, and the lights in the cabin behind them flickered once, then went out completely. Rick stumbled backward. "Tony, what is this thing?" Tony's eyes stayed fixed on the fragment. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but whatever it is, this wasn't the first time it's been found." The storm rolled in without warning, thick clouds swallowing the Yukon sky, winds bending the trees until they groaned. By late evening, the entire camp was on edge. Even the generator's steady rhythm sounded uneasy, sputtering now and then, like it wanted to quit. Tony tried to keep the men working, but no one would step near the dredge. Not after the noises, not after the footprints, not after the fragment began glowing like it had a heartbeat. Rain hammered the metal roof of the tool shed, as Tony unwrapped the fragment one last time. It pulsed stronger now, bright enough to cast faint lines across his face. Strange markings twisted across its surface, rearranging themselves as if responding to his presence. Rick barged in, drenched, breathing heavily. Tony, the dredge. It's humming again, louder than before. Another vibration rolled through the ground beneath them, low, steady, alive. Tony didn't hesitate this time. He tucked the fragment under his arm and marched into the storm, rain slapping against his jacket. Rick chased after him, shouting for him to slow down. When they reached the dredge, every light on the structure flickered violently. The buckets twitched, chains rattled on their own, and at the center of the machine, behind the metal grating, a faint glow pulsed, matching the rhythm of the fragment in Tony's hands. Rick grabbed him. "Tony! Don't go in there!" But Tony's expression had changed. Calm, focused, almost entranced. "It's calling it back," Tony muttered, "and I have to see why." Before Rick could stop him, Tony climbed the ladder and disappeared inside. The hum grew louder, deeper, until the entire valley trembled. Rick shouted his name, but the storm swallowed his voice. Then, a flash. A violent surge of light from inside the dredge. The hum stopped instantly. Silence. Rick ran up the ladder. Inside, Tony was gone. Only the fragment remained, split clean down the middle, its glow completely dead. That night, the storm cleared as fast as it arrived, but the dredge stayed dark, cold, and hollow, as if something important had been taken from it. By sunrise, every worker knew Tony hadn't returned. His truck was still parked by the cabin. His boots sat neatly beside the door, but there was no sign of him anywhere on the claim. To this day, nobody knows what happened in that last moment inside the dredge. Some say Tony merged with whatever was calling from within. Others swear the machine took him, claimed him, because he'd awakened something that should have stayed buried. But one thing is certain: on quiet Yukon nights, when the wind hits just right, the dredge still hums.